This is FlappyBoid Chapter 10. In this chapter, what we're going to concentrate on is creating some visible targets for scoring. And I'm going to put these between my pairs of pipes. You could do something like a coin or something that you've modeled, but I'm going to actually show you CRYENGINE's modeling tool, which is called Designer, and model a 5-pointed star. Now, it's worth learning a bit about the modeling tool because it's so handy for whiteboxing your levels. Although, of course, it's not designed to replace full-featured modeling tools like Max or Maya. What I'm going to do is zoom way back here and come down close to the ocean, not underwater. And it's going to be helpful to have the terrain on for this modeling process. Since I've moved my terrain under the water, I'm going to hide the ocean right here. And I'm going to move the terrain up. So I'm going to go here to Set Terrain Max Height. My ocean is currently at 30 meters, so I'm going to move my terrain up back to the default height of 32 meters. However, you're not going to see anything happen, and if you move the camera down, even with the ocean hidden, you're still going to get this visual cue that you're under the water. In order to actually regenerate the terrain at the new max height, I've got to erase the terrain. And this is a bit misleading because what that really means is simply to erase the height map. So it's going to regenerate a new height map at the new max height of 32, and now I'm above the water. So I'm ready to start modeling. If you haven't already, you need to turn on the Designer tool. You're going to see it twice in the main menu, Modeling and UV Mapping. You want to go to Modeling. The Designer tool has a lot of components here and a lot of panels, so it would be helpful to make this panel reasonably wide. The first step for creating a 5-pointed star is to use some kind of primitive that's going to get us close to that. And actually the easiest one is going to be a cylinder, although it may seem a bit counterintuitive. The trick to making this work for us is using subdivisions. So we're going to use 5 subdivisions to generate a 5-sided shape instead of simply a rounded cylinder. And I want to make sure my grid snap is turned off for this. It's helpful if I'm kind of looking down on the terrain like this. So I'm going to just tilt my camera. And I'm going to make a shape about 4 meters. This is going to end up being the center of my star. So I'm going to create my shape about 4 meters in diameter here, according to these dimensions. And I need to zoom out a bit, give myself a little more room. Once I get close to 4 meters, I click, and then I need to make the height. So I'm going to reposition my camera so I can kind of see myself drawing the height, zoom back a bit. And this is going to be the thickness of your star, so this is really a personal decision. I guess I'll make mine about 1 meter or so. It's really just a creative choice. Once I've got that, the trick here is to remember to stop this mode. Otherwise, if I continue clicking, I'm going to continue making cylinders, and they're all going to be attached to each other. So click on this X in the Designer tool to get out of that mode. So now I have my 5-sided cylinder. And what I want to do to make the points is extrude these sides out about the same 4-meter width. And then I'm going to collapse the 4 points here, these 4 vertices, to a single point. So first I need to select each of these polygons one at a time. So I click on the Polygon tool, click on one of these faces, give myself a little room to work here. And then I'm going to use my Extrude tool. And I'm simply going to pull this out about the same width as the star itself. So about another 4 meters. If anything, make these a little bit on the long side. Now here's a trick. After I've dragged that out, hold down the Alt button on the keyboard and left mouse button click on the next polygon. You don't have to use the Polygon tool again, and it will repeat exactly the same extrusion without having to worry about matching what you did in terms of length. Alt click. I'm just circling around with the camera. Alt click. And one more Alt click. And this is the shape that you should have. And finally, click on the X to close that particular extrusion tool. The next step is to collapse each of these faces to a single point. And as you might guess, that is my collapse tool here. So I need to make sure I have my designer entity selected. I need to use the Polygon tool to select it first, and then use the collapse tool, and it collapses the selected polygon immediately. Let me do that again. This one, unfortunately, you cannot use the Alt left mouse button click trick to repeat. So you've got to do it again. So a polygon, select the face, and collapse. And just repeat that 3 more times. I guess the reason you can't Alt repeat this is it's a two-step process. And there's our star. You can see now why I said to extrude those sides out quite a bit. I'm not entirely happy with my star. It's kind of clunky and chunky, so I wish I had extruded these further. Maybe you do a better job than I did. The next thing I want to do is rotate the star to stand up on these 2 points. So for this, I'm going to kind of rotate my camera down here, come in a little bit, grab my rotate tool, and in this case I'm going to spin about this axis, and the rotation snap is going to come in handy. Now that I have it standing upright, I'm just going to move my star up into the air a bit like that. And actually what I'm trying to do is just make sure that my rotation is perfect. Not the rotation of standing it up, but the rotation this way, spinning or like around an analog clock face. So I'm just coming in to take a close look and make sure that these points seem equidistant from the ground. Chances are that yours is not going to end up having the pivot exactly where you want it to be because of this rotation. So what we want to do is make sure that the pivot is dead center in the object. So back in the designer tool, we click on pivot under the selection panel, and you may need to move your camera angle because you want to be able to see these 3 points, and if you're facing the star at a front angle like this, they're going to overlap like that. So we want to come in here, and this is an incredibly simple tool. It's hard to tell that you've done anything, but you simply click on that particular vertex, and now it is the pivot for the object. And you can tell if you turn off your designer tool, and you can see if you inspect it from different angles that the pivot is now dead center. The other thing I want to do is now tell the modeling tool that this particular position, which is rotated 90 degrees, if you look in our properties, to tell the designer tool that this rotation is actually our normal position, that it's not rotated, but I want to zero out all of these aspects. The next thing I want to do is normalize this particular position of the star. And that means that the 90-degree rotation that I did, for example, is going to become 0. I'm going to normalize it once to get rid of this rotation, and I'm going to use this tool under the Advanced panel, Transform, Reset Transform, and I want to make sure that all of these are checked: position, rotation, and scale. I'm going to go ahead and do this once, and what we should see in the properties here is that 90-degree rotation has gone away. So now when I go and close the designer tool, go up to here to where I want to put it, and I press the P key twice to get into this pick object snap to pivot mode. When I click on the next entity, the star is going to snap to that position. Its pivot is at the bottom, and so the star snaps to that automatically. If I hadn't reset it once, it would have ended up getting flipped back to its normal flat position, which would make a mess for me. So I'm going to position it a little bit like this, and I'm going to scale it down a bit because it's just a little big. I'm going to turn off my helpers so that I can see better, because all the helpers are actually hiding my scale tool a bit. I'm just going to bring this down a bit so it's not quite crowding the gap between the pipes so much. Maybe move it up a bit. Take a look at it like that. I'm just looking here to check and get my camera position to exactly 100 meters so that I can evaluate whether this is sort of centered between these things. You could also try this trick of changing the field of view of your camera to a much longer lens, let's say something like 20 degrees, and that's going to introduce less distortion, and it'll be easier to see that this entity is centered between your pair of pipes. That's fine. I'm looking at it. It's parallel to the pipes, which is fine. I don't know that I'll have all 4 of them that way, but that's a good starting point. I'm also going to go back to my normal default field of view, which happens to be 60 degrees. The next thing I want to do is create a material for our star. You can go crazy with this, but to illustrate some concepts about shaders, I'm going to build a translucent glass material. I want to go to my Material Editor Legacy. As you already know, there's a lot to this, so you're going to want to make this fairly wide. And under generic glass, there's a frosted glass material that I'm going to use as the basis for what I want to make. I'm going to go ahead and assign it to the star. There we go. And so you can see it's sort of transparent like this, translucent rather. If you see nothing, if you see it disappear, that's because you have your background box on, which is the whole point that I'm trying to illustrate. For now, what I want you to do is simply hide the background box the way I've done, and I'm going to explain what the issue is and how to fix it. What I want to do is duplicate this material and make a modified version. So I'm going to right-click on it in the Material Editor Legacy and say Duplicate. And I'm then going to rename, and I'm going to call this whatever, frosted red and blue. And I'm going to keep it in the same glass folder. And then a kind of an orange on the specular color. And don't forget to assign your duplicated material to the star with this button right here. As I see it lit from different angles, it's going to catch the light and be a little bit interesting. What I'm planning on doing is making the star rotate, and the glass will catch the light in some interesting ways with these different colors here. I'm going to save. And now let's talk about the problem that we're having. I'm just going to call this my star template for reasons that will become obvious in a minute. And I'm going to turn my background box on, and the star disappears completely. And what I want you to do is rotate the camera around so that you're looking at the star from the other side, like this. Obviously, my background box is really close to it, so it's sort of hard to see. If the background box isn't in the background of the camera, I see this thing fine. So that implies that there's some sort of problem between the background box and how it's interacting with the star. Well, the problem is the shader. So if we go and I need to unfreeze my background box, and I'm going to retrieve the material that was created for it, our moving sky background. We used a shader called reference image instead of alum. If I turn the alum shader back on, I see the star perfectly fine. The problem with the reference image shader is it eliminates all lighting and shadows. So when I have a translucent material like that, it simply doesn't render. So we're not going to be able to continue to use this background box as is. You could mess with these settings, but for now, I'm going to abandon this background, and I'm going to turn on volumetric clouds, which I had introduced earlier. So in the console tool, I'm going to set these to 1. And then the reason that I didn't use these in the first place is that I want to be able to get them to move. There's an easy way to do that, which is first go to my level settings and turn on some wind. I want the wind to blow to the left on the x-axis, so I'll try something like 10 meters per second. And then in the environment editor, I actually need to enable this influence for the volumetric clouds. And that's this setting right here under volumetric clouds, wind influence. I'll try a value like 5. It'd be helpful if I could see my clouds so I can see that they're moving. And I'm going to go back to my sort of default camera position. I can see a little bit of movement going on there. I'm going to try a larger wind in 20. As it turns out, there's no way to dynamically control this wind influence or the wind speed in FlowGraph during the game. But I'm not going to worry about that too much right now. We are going to have the same problem that we had in the beginning if I go ahead and test the game, which is that my poor Flappy is also going to get affected by the wind, and he's going to quickly get pushed out of the game area. So how can we fix that? How can we keep the wind and just affect the volumetric clouds, or let's say, affect everything except my Flappy? This answer is not the most intuitive thing in the world, but we need to go down to physics and buoyancy, which obviously has to deal with how the object reacts to water. But the funny thing is that CRYENGINE really regards water and air as atmospheres. And so these settings, water damping and water resistance, are going to affect its response to both water and air. So what I'm going to do is simply disable them by setting them both to -1. If I go in and test the game, we'll see that the clouds are moving, and if there was anything else that was affected, it would be moving as well, but Flappy stays in position. There's one more thing that we need to do to actually make use of this star in the game. We could use it as it is. It's not a terribly complex entity, but there's something about the designer tool that you should know. As I said, it's not designed to replace a full-fledged modeling tool, and it doesn't really make ideal models in terms of economy and the vertex count. So if you do white box something that you like and end up creating a material for and say, well, I want to go ahead and use this in the game, there's no reason to redo it in Max or Maya, the last step that you should do is to export it as a standard CGF model. So if we go to this same Advanced Transform tab in the Designer tool, I have my designer object selected, I'm going to click on Export, which will reveal these options here. And I'm just going to do a CGF. And I'm going to put this in my Objects folder, Props, FlappyBoid. And I'll just call this star. I've already done this once, so I'm just going ahead and replacing it. And now I'm done with this designer object. So what I could do, again, don't forget to close the designer tool. What I could do is delete it. But if you're nervous about deleting it, or if you just want to hang on to it for reference purposes, I'm going to hide my ocean, you could move it somewhere down to the terrain that's just out of sight. So I'm going to do exactly that. I'm going to zoom way back here, out of sight, and I'm going to Control-Shift-Click to snap it to the terrain, and there it's going to sit, and I'm never going to look at it again. Now I'm going to actually import the real thing with my Create Object tool. Before I do this, this reminds me, let's go ahead and restore our terrain and ocean settings. So I'm going to go back to my terrain editor and set my terrain max height back to where it was at 0. And now we should see this, that it's well under the water. So now I'm ready to add my entity, create object, legacy entity. I want to come down to the physics group, and I'm just going to use a basic entity. Drag it onto here. If it ends up way back in the terrain, you can use that trick. I can see that it's there, but if we look at our properties, you can see that it's way back there someplace. So I'm going to use that snap to pivot trick where I have the object selected. I press the P key twice. I get into the snap to pivot mode, and then I'm just going to click here. And I'm going to go ahead and put it dead center because it's going to be my star, and replace the model. And go to my objects, props, FlappyBoid folder, pick my star. May need to adjust the position because of where the pivot is. And I probably need to move it down 4 meters like that. And I'm going to go ahead and give it a name. I'm going to call mine Score Star 1. And I'm going to create 4 copies of that. I want to do some animation on these stars. First thing I want to do is make them spin continuously. That's super simple. I'm going to select my first score star here, go back to my flow graph. I'm going to put it next to initial setup because it is going to start when the game starts, and it's going to continue the whole game. And I'm just going to use a simple rotate entity node like this. I mentioned this before, it's not like rotate entity to X. It doesn't have a trigger once I kick it into motion. Unless I trigger this pause, it's just going to go and go and go. So in terms of figuring out which axis it is, remember that Z is up and down. So if you imagine a pole sticking in the ground, that's your Z axis. And I'm going to choose to spin my star around that axis, around that vertical pole. I have no idea. I'll just try a speed of something like this. And I need to assign the star there. It would probably be smart to test this first before I copy it. But having built this before, I know that this is going to work fine. So I'm going to go ahead and copy it 4 more times. And then all I need to do is assign the correct entities. And before I test this, I know I want these stars to move. They're going to become part of the pipe assemblies. So I'm going to go ahead and link them. And again, I'm just dragging them onto the respective pipe. I think I mentioned this before, but you don't have to have your entities in the same layer, even if they're linked. However, it may make more sense to move them to this layer. So I'm going to go ahead and drag them to the pipes. And there's our entities. So now our stars should travel with the pipes and spin as they do so. And now you see I have collisions. See if you can figure out what I forgot or what we need to do so that we're not colliding with these stars, but we can simply pass right through them. And the answer is we need to de-physicalize them like this. What I'm ultimately going to do here is make the stars seem to explode when the player touches them and then disappear. And of course they'll spawn as the pipes spawn again. So let's try this again. I'm going to save and test. And now our Flappy passes right through the stars and they're spinning beautifully. The only other thing you might want to do is make them not all start in the same position at the same time. So for example, I could come here, select my star here, and rotate it a bit about the Z-axis. I don't know, let's say every 30 degrees. So that they're just in different positions when they start the game. Like that. And now we're starting to get a pretty good looking game. Made my stars a little bigger than I should have. They feel like they're sort of grinding on the bottom pipe, but I'm sure you can do better.